Maybe it's time Evelyn stopped depending on everyone else. My daughter-in-law said over pot roast and mashed potatoes, like she was commenting on the weather instead of my entire existence. My son lowered his eyes and kept cutting his steak. That was the moment I realized grief had not made me invisible. It had simply made them comfortable enough to say what they had been thinking all along. I'm Evelyn Parker. I'm 71 years old, and until 4 months ago, I had been married to the same man for nearly 48 years. My husband Thomas built our home in Fairfield County with his own hands long before property values turned our quiet neighborhood into something people called exclusive. Back then, it was just a sleepy Connecticut street with maple trees, cracked sidewalks, and children riding bicycles until the porch lights came on. We raised our son Daniel in that house. Every birthday candle, every Christmas morning, every school picture still lived somewhere inside those walls. But after Thomas died, the house began to feel unfamiliar in ways I couldn't explain. It started slowly. Rachel changed the curtains in the dining room 2 weeks after the funeral. She said the old floral ones made the place look dated. Then she moved Thomas's leather reading chair out of the den because it took up too much space. One afternoon, I came downstairs and found framed family photos missing from the hallway. In their place were abstract black and white prints that looked cold enough to belong in a hotel lobby. I told myself I was imagining things. People grieve differently. Young couples like modern styles. I tried to stay gracious. That's what women from my generation do. We smooth edges. We make excuses for people we love. But that dinner changed something inside me. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the dining room chandelier cast pale gold light across the mahogany table Thomas had bought during our 25th anniversary trip to Vermont. Rachel sipped red wine from my crystal glasses while talking about kitchen renovations as though the house already belonged to her. Open floor plans are much more practical, she said casually. Especially once the extra rooms are finally cleared out. Her eyes flicked toward me for half a second before returning to her plate. Daniel noticed it. I know he did. But instead of defending me, he reached for the salt shaker and asked if anyone wanted dessert. The silence hurt more than the insult itself. I looked at my son and suddenly remembered a little boy who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms because he was afraid of lightning. Thomas would laugh and tell him, "Your mother makes this house safe." I spent decades believing that mattered. After dinner, Rachel stood near the sink scrolling through luxury kitchen designs on her phone while I wrapped leftovers into plastic containers. "You shouldn't overdo it, Evelyn," she said sweetly. "At your age, stress can become dangerous." At your age? Not Mom. Not Evelyn Parker. Just a problem to be managed carefully until removed. I dried my hands slowly on a dish towel and glanced through the kitchen window into the dark backyard Thomas once loved. The porch swing moved gently in the wind. And for the first time since my husband died, I understood something with absolute clarity. They thought silence meant weakness. They had forgotten whose name Thomas placed on everything before he died. The next morning, I woke before sunrise the way I always had during my years with Thomas. For nearly 5 decades, our mornings followed the same rhythm. Coffee first. Then the newspaper spread across the kitchen table while soft jazz played from the old radio near the window. Even after retirement, Thomas still woke at 6 every morning as if his body no longer understood how to rest. But now the kitchen sat silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the sound of rainwater dripping from the gutters outside. I stood there in my robe staring at the empty chair across from me, the one Rachel wanted removed because it no longer matched the room. The coffee tasted weaker lately, or maybe grief had simply changed everything. I carried my mug into the den and stopped short when I saw Thomas's bookshelf half empty. For a moment I thought I was imagining it. Then I noticed the cardboard boxes stacked neatly beside the hallway closet. Labels written in Rachel's careful handwriting covered the sides. Donate. Storage. Old papers. My fingers tightened around the coffee mug. Thomas loved those books. Histories, biographies, old mystery novels with cracked spines and handwritten notes in the margins. He reread the same Hemingway collection every autumn while sitting beside the fireplace with a wool blanket over his knees. I knelt slowly beside one of the boxes and pulled out a framed photograph instead. Daniel at age 8 standing beside Thomas after a Little League game, both of them grinning proudly under the summer sun. Before I could finish looking at it, Rachel's voice floated down from upstairs. "Evelyn, We are trying to organize things before the appraiser comes next month. I froze. Appraiser. She appeared at the top of the staircase wearing cream-colored workout clothes and holding a stainless steel travel mug like she was on her way to a yoga class instead of dismantling my life one room at a time. The house just has too much clutter, she added casually. Modern buyers prefer cleaner spaces. Buyers. My chest tightened so sharply I had to set the coffee mug down before my hands started shaking visibly. Who said anything about buyers? I asked quietly. Rachel descended the stairs without looking at me directly. Nobody is making decisions yet, she said with that same polished voice she used whenever she wanted to sound reasonable. We are just exploring options. Daniel worries this place is too much for you now. Too much for me. I almost laughed at the absurdity of hearing that inside the very house I had cleaned, repaired, decorated, and protected for nearly half a century. I remembered painting the nursery walls pale blue while 7 months pregnant with Daniel. I remembered clipping coupons to afford new kitchen appliances during the recession in the 1980s. I remembered standing beside Thomas in the driveway during winter storms while we shoveled snow together because we could not afford a snow service back then. Too much for me. Rachel checked her smartwatch and headed toward the kitchen. Oh, and one more thing, she said lightly. Daniel thought it. Might be safer if we moved your bedroom downstairs eventually. The stairs are becoming a concern. The stairs. Yesterday it had been stress. Today it was stairs. Small sentences. Tiny cuts. Each one carefully designed to shrink my place inside my own home without ever sounding openly cruel. After she left the room, I sat alone beside those donation boxes for a very long time. Outside, the gray Connecticut sky hung low over the backyard while cold rain soaked the porch swing Thomas built 20 years ago. Somewhere upstairs, I heard Rachel vacuuming our bedroom. Not the guest room. Not Daniel's old room. Our bedroom. And that was when I finally understood this was never about helping me grieve. They were preparing the house for life after Evelyn Parker. 3 days later, Daniel started knocking before entering my bedroom. That may not sound strange to most people, but my son had never knocked on a door in this house his entire life. As a teenager, he used to storm into rooms looking for baseball cleats or car keys without a second thought. Now every movement around me felt measured, careful, rehearsed. Mom, he said one Thursday morning while leaning against the doorway. Have you been remembering to take your blood pressure medication? I looked up from the crossword puzzle in my lap. Yes, I answered slowly. Why? He shrugged too quickly. No reason. Rachel just worries about you living alone if something happens. Living alone. The words settled heavily into the room because I was not living alone. They had moved into my house 6 weeks after Thomas died under the excuse of helping me adjust. At first, I appreciated the company. Grief makes silence feel enormous at night. But now I understood they had not moved in to support me. They had moved in early to establish themselves before I could gather my footing again. Daniel stepped farther into the room, hands tucked into the pockets of his navy sweater. He looked exhausted lately, dark circles under his eyes, tension pulling at the corners of his mouth. Rachel's influence had changed him in subtle ways over the years, but lately it felt more severe, as though he had become a smaller version of himself. We're actually thinking about taking a drive this weekend, he said carefully. There is a retirement community about 30 minutes from here that has really beautiful cottages. Indoor pool, fitness center, restaurant dining. I stared at him for several seconds without answering. Retirement community, not nursing home, not assisted living. They always wrapped ugly intentions inside pleasant words now. I still drive myself to the grocery store, I replied quietly. I still pay my own bills. I still climb the stairs just fine. Daniel gave a strained smile. Nobody is saying otherwise, Mom. We just want you somewhere easier to manage. Easier to manage. There it was again. Every conversation now sounded like a corporate meeting discussing a difficult employee rather than a son speaking to his mother. That afternoon, I went downstairs and discovered Rachel sitting at the kitchen island with a woman I had never seen before. They both stopped talking the moment I entered the room. The woman wore a beige pantsuit and had a leather folder resting beside her coffee cup. Rachel smiled brightly. Too brightly. Evelyn, this is Melissa, she said. She specializes in senior transition planning. Senior transition planning. I felt something cold move through my chest. Melissa extended her hand with the polished sympathy of someone accustomed to dealing with grieving older people. Rachel has told me so much about you, she said warmly. We simply wanted to discuss options that could make life less stressful moving forward. I noticed brochures spread across the marble countertop. Photos of smiling gray-haired couples standing beside ponds and flower gardens. Comfortable living. Maintenance-free lifestyle. Peace of mind for your golden years. I looked at Rachel then. Really looked at her. Her posture remained perfectly relaxed, but excitement flickered behind her eyes for half a second before disappearing again beneath practiced concern. They had already started planning my exit. Not someday. Now. You should have told me we were having company, I said calmly. Rachel blinked, clearly expecting resistance instead of politeness. Well, we did not want to overwhelm you, she answered carefully. I nodded once and reached for the tea kettle beside the stove. My hands remained perfectly steady. How thoughtful, I said softly. But as water filled the kettle, I caught my reflection in the dark kitchen window above the sink. For the first time since Thomas died, the woman staring back at me did not look heartbroken. She looked awake. That night, I could not sleep. Rain pressed softly against the bedroom windows while the old grandfather clock downstairs marked each passing hour with slow, hollow chimes. Beside me, Thomas's side of the bed remained untouched exactly the way I had left it after the funeral. His reading glasses still rested on the nightstand beside a half-finished biography about Theodore Roosevelt. Every few days I told myself I should put those things away. Every few days I failed. Around 2 in the morning, I finally got up and wrapped myself in the heavy cream-colored cardigan Thomas bought me during our trip to Maine years ago. The house felt colder lately despite the thermostat remaining the same. I padded quietly downstairs and stopped in the den when I noticed faint lights spilling beneath the door. For a moment I thought Daniel was still awake working. Instead, I found myself staring at Thomas's old desk. The leather chair creaked softly as I sat down, and suddenly the smell of cedarwood and old paper surrounded me so strongly that my chest tightened. Thomas loved this room. He called it his thinking place. Even after retirement, he spent hours there balancing checkbooks, reading newspapers, or listening to jazz records while snow fell outside the windows in winter. My fingers drifted across the polished wood surface until they landed on a small scratch near the corner. Daniel made that mark with a toy truck when he was 6 years old. I remember apologizing over and over while Thomas laughed and said, "It is only furniture, Evelyn. Someday we will miss these little accidents." For several minutes, I simply sat there listening to the quiet hum of the house. Then my eyes moved toward the bottom drawer on the right side of the desk. Locked. Thomas always kept personal documents there. Not because he distrusted me, but because he believed important papers should stay organized. I almost stood up and walked away. Instead, I opened the top drawer slowly and found exactly what I expected resting beneath a stack of old receipts. The tiny silver key. My hand trembled slightly as I slid the drawer open. Inside sat neatly arranged folders, tax records, property documents, insurance policies. Everything perfectly labeled in Thomas's careful handwriting. Then I noticed a sealed envelope near the back. My name written across the front in blue ink. Evelyn. Nothing else. Just Evelyn. Suddenly I could hear his voice so clearly that it made my throat ache. Calm. Steady. Practical. The way he always sounded when discussing serious matters. I opened the envelope carefully and unfolded a single handwritten letter. Evelyn, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer there to handle things myself. I know you. You will try to keep the peace even when people stop deserving it. That line alone made tears sting my eyes because it was exactly what I had been doing since the funeral. Making excuses. Staying quiet. Shrinking myself to avoid conflict inside my own home. I continued reading slowly. Daniel has a good heart, but weakness can be dangerous in a man who wants to be loved too badly. Rachel worries me more than I ever admitted openly. Watch carefully before trusting completely. My breathing slowed. Outside, wind rattled the branches against the windows while the old house settled around me with familiar creaks. Then I reached the final paragraph. The trust documents have already been updated with Harold. Promise me something. If anyone ever tries to make you feel unwelcome here, do not surrender this house out of guilt or loneliness. I protected you while I was alive. I intend to protect you after I am gone. I lowered the letter into my lap and stared into the darkness for a long time. Upstairs, I heard footsteps moving across the hallway floorboards. Rachel, probably checking locks before bed the way she always did now. But down there in the quiet den surrounded by Thomas's handwriting and the life we built together, something inside me finally settled into place. They believed grief had made me fragile. They had no idea my husband saw this coming long before I did. The following Tuesday, I drove into downtown Westport alone for the first time since Thomas passed away. Rachel had offered to come with me that morning in the overly cheerful tone she now used whenever she wanted information. I told her I was meeting an old church friend for coffee. Technically, it was not a lie. Harold Whitmore had attended our church for years before retiring from regular practice. Thomas trusted him more than anyone outside the family. The law office looked exactly the same as it had 10 years earlier. Dark wood walls, leather chairs, the faint scent of coffee and old paper lingering in the waiting area. Even the receptionist, Sandra, still wore the same pearl necklace she always favored. Her expression softened immediately when she saw me walk through the door. "Mrs. Parker," she said gently, "it is good to see you again." I smiled politely and held my handbag tighter against my side. "Thank you, Sandra." Harold emerged from his office moments later, tall and silver-haired, his reading glasses hanging low against his chest on a thin cord. Age had bent his shoulders slightly, but his eyes remained sharp in the way only experienced attorney's eyes can be. The kind of eyes that notice things people try to hide. He shook my hand carefully and closed the office door behind us once we stepped inside. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Harold looked directly at me and said quietly, "Thomas expected you might come eventually." Those words settled heavily into the room. I sat slowly in the chair across from his desk, while morning light filtered through the tall windows overlooking Main Street. Outside, people carried shopping bags and coffee cups beneath bright red autumn leaves like ordinary life was continuing untouched. "I found his letter," I admitted softly. Harold nodded once as though he had been waiting to hear that exact sentence. "Then you already know he was concerned." Concerned. Such a polite word for what was actually happening inside my home. I looked down at my wedding ring for a moment before speaking again. "They are trying to move me out," I said quietly, slowly, carefully, as if they are afraid I might notice if they moved too fast. Harold leaned back in his chair and removed a thick folder from his desk drawer. My name appeared across the tab in neat black lettering. Evelyn Parker estate documents. "Thomas updated everything nearly 3 years ago," he explained calmly. "He requested specific protective clauses after several conversations regarding Daniel and Rachel. Hearing their names spoken so formally inside a law office made my chest tighten unexpectedly." Harold opened the folder and slid several pages toward me. Dense legal language filled the paper, but one paragraph had been highlighted lightly in yellow. "This section matters most," Harold said. I adjusted my glasses and began reading slowly. "Any beneficiary found guilty of coercion, intimidation, neglect, or attempts to improperly remove Evelyn Parker from the marital residence shall immediately forfeit all inheritance rights under the Parker Family Trust." I stared at the page without breathing for several seconds. Harold folded his hands carefully atop the desk. "Your husband was a very intelligent man," he said quietly. "He understood that financial pressure inside families rarely begins with shouting. It begins with subtle erosion, small humiliations, isolation, manipulation disguised as concern." Every sentence felt painfully familiar. The brochures, the comments about stairs, the donation boxes, the careful way Rachel spoke about my future as though I were no longer sitting in the room. "Daniel does not know this clause exists," I asked finally. Harold shook his head once. "Thomas insisted the details remain confidential unless activation became necessary." Activation. Such a cold word for the destruction of a family. Outside the office window, church bells rang softly somewhere down the street. I looked back down at the highlighted paragraph, while something calm and steady settled inside me for the first time in months. Rachel believed she was carefully positioning me out of my own life. But she had overlooked one thing entirely. Thomas Parker had been paying attention long before I ever started. When I returned home from Harold's office that afternoon, Rachel was standing in the front hallway holding one of my winter coats over her arm. "Perfect timing," she said brightly. "I was just sorting through things for donation." For one brief moment, neither of us moved. The coat hanging from her hand was camel-colored wool with pearl buttons down the front. Thomas bought it for me during our anniversary trip to Chicago almost 15 years earlier. I wore it every Christmas Eve since. Rachel smiled as though she was doing me a favor. You hardly wear this anymore, she added lightly. I set my handbag down slowly on the entry table beside the bowl where Thomas used to toss his car keys every evening after work. Put it back in my closet, I said calmly. Rachel blinked. Not because of my words, but because of the tone. It was the first time in months I had spoken to her without uncertainty wrapped around every sentence. Oh, she said after a second. Of course. She folded the coat carefully and disappeared upstairs while I stood alone in the hallway listening to the quiet creaks of the staircase. Something subtle shifted inside the house after that. Rachel became sweeter. Too sweet. Daniel started checking on me constantly, asking if I slept well, offering to refill my medications, suggesting I stop driving during rainy weather. Every act of concern now felt rehearsed, as though they had both agreed upon a script while I was not in the room. One evening during dinner, Rachel placed a glossy brochure beside my plate before serving baked salmon and roasted asparagus. I found another community that might suit you better, she said gently. This one has private cottages and garden clubs. It is really lovely. Daniel nodded immediately without looking up from his wine glass. You should at least visit, Mom. I glanced down at the brochure. Smiling older couples stood beside a pond beneath the words Serenity Pines Living. Maintenance-free comfort for your next chapter. Next chapter. Such a pleasant phrase for being carefully removed from your own life. I folded the brochure once and placed it beside my napkin. I am not going anywhere, I said quietly. Silence settled over the table almost. Instantly, Rachel recovered first. Nobody is forcing you, she replied with practiced patience. We just think you deserve less stress. Less stress. As if stress had somehow entered my life naturally instead of arriving through the front door, carrying designer luggage and renovation plans. After dinner, I carried dishes into the kitchen while Rachel lingered near the island whispering to Daniel in low voices. They stopped talking when I entered the room. Again, everything happened in fragments now. Half-finished conversations, sudden silences, meaningful glances exchanged over coffee cups. The next morning, I discovered new locks installed on the side garage door. Nobody mentioned it to me. I only noticed because my key no longer fit. Rachel looked genuinely surprised when I brought it up over breakfast. Oh goodness, Daniel must have forgotten to tell you, she said smoothly while stirring almond milk into her coffee. The old locks were becoming unreliable. Daniel mumbled something about neighborhood safety without meeting my eyes. I nodded once and buttered my toast carefully. Of course, I said. But later that afternoon, while folding laundry upstairs, I noticed something else. Rachel had moved all my family photo albums from the upstairs linen closet into cardboard storage bins labeled basement. I sat on the edge of the guest bed, holding one of the albums in my lap for a very long time. Inside were photographs spanning 40 years. Daniel missing his front teeth at age 7. Thomas grilling hamburgers every 4th of July. Christmas mornings beside overflowing stockings. Entire decades of my life quietly packed away downstairs like seasonal decorations no longer needed. That evening, I returned the albums to the closet myself. Slowly, carefully, one stack at a time. And for the first time since Thomas died, I stopped trying to appear grateful for people who were preparing my disappearance. By early November, the house no longer sounded like mine. Rachel played soft, instrumental music through the downstairs speakers every morning now. The kind you hear in expensive hotel lobbies where everything smells faintly of eucalyptus and nobody raises their voice. Above a whisper, the television in the den stayed tuned to home renovation shows while fabric samples and paint swatches slowly spread across the kitchen island like quiet little invasions. One afternoon, I walked downstairs and found a contractor standing in my dining room measuring windows. He glanced up politely when I entered. "You must be Mrs. Parker," he said with a friendly smile. "Rachel says this room is getting completely opened up." Rachel says. Not we discussed. Not the family decided. Rachel says. She appeared moments later carrying a leather notebook against her chest. "I hope you do not mind," she said lightly. "We are just exploring possibilities for the future." Future. That word again. Always spoken as though mine no longer existed. I looked around the dining room slowly. The mahogany table still sat beneath the chandelier Thomas spent 6 months restoring by hand after buying it at an estate auction. Tiny scratches marked the wood surface from decades of Thanksgiving dinners and birthday cakes and school projects spread across newspapers. Daniel learned long division at that table. I signed every Christmas card there for 47 years. Rachel saw square footage. I saw an entire life. No walls are being removed, I said calmly. The contractor looked uncomfortable immediately. Rachel's smile tightened only slightly before returning. Of course not right now, she replied smoothly. Nobody is trying to upset you. Upset me. As though emotional fragility explained everything instead of manipulation. That evening, I sat quietly in the den while Rachel and Daniel talked in the kitchen, believing I could not hear them over the dishwasher. We cannot keep waiting forever, Rachel whispered sharply. If she refuses to cooperate, this gets much harder legally. Legally? My pulse slowed instead of quickening. Strange how clarity removes fear. Daniel sounded exhausted. She is still grieving, Rachel. And we are trying to help her before something happens. Rachel snapped back. Do you really want to spend the next 10 years managing this house and her medical issues? Medical issues. I stared down at my knitting needles resting untouched in my lap, while the dishwasher hummed steadily nearby. 10 years. They were already discussing the remainder of my life, like a financial burden requiring strategic planning. The next morning, Rachel knocked softly on my bedroom door carrying a slim folder and a mug of tea. Honey chamomile. My favorite. The performance almost impressed me. I wanted to go over a few things with you while Daniel is at work, she said warmly. She sat carefully beside me on the edge of the bed and opened the folder across her knees. These are just precautionary documents in case of emergencies. Power authorization, medical coordination, temporary financial oversight if you become overwhelmed. Her voice remained gentle and patient, the exact tone people use with frightened children. I accepted the reading glasses she handed me and slowly scanned the paperwork. Harold's words echoed quietly in my mind. Coercion, manipulation disguised as concern. Rachel leaned closer beside me, her perfume soft and expensive. It would make everything much easier, she said carefully, especially if there was ever confusion about the house later on. There it was. Finally, not hidden beneath brochures or fake sympathy. The house. I lowered the papers into my lap and looked at her directly for several long seconds. Rachel held my gaze with practiced calm, but beneath it I noticed something else now. Impatience. Hunger. She believed she was close. I will need some time to think, I said quietly. Relief flashed across her face so quickly she probably did not realize I noticed it. Of course, she replied smoothly while gathering the papers back into the folder. Take all the time you need. After she left the room, I walked slowly to the bedroom window overlooking the backyard. Thin November sunlight stretched across the porch swing while dead leaves drifted across the lawn Thomas once raked every Sunday afternoon without fail. Downstairs, I heard Rachel humming softly to herself in the kitchen. She sounded happy, confident, victorious even. And for the first time, I allowed her to believe she was winning. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday morning at Harold Whitmore's office. Rachel insisted on driving. She wore a cream-colored cashmere coat and pearl earrings Thomas once gave me for our 40th wedding anniversary. I recognized them immediately the moment she walked downstairs. She caught me looking and smiled calmly. You said you never wore them anymore, she explained while adjusting the clasp near her neck. I simply nodded and picked up my handbag. Daniel barely spoke during the drive into town. Gray November clouds hung low above the highway while soft jazz played quietly through the car speakers. Rachel spent most of the ride discussing kitchen renovation estimates and property taxes as though the outcome of today's meeting had already been decided privately in her favor. Every few minutes, she glanced at me with carefully measured sympathy. This will make everything less stressful for you in the long run, she said gently at one point. I watched bare trees blur past the passenger window without answering. Harold's office looked warmer than usual when we arrived. A fire crackled softly inside the stone fireplace near the waiting area, while Sandra greeted us with the same polite professionalism she always maintained. But I noticed something else immediately. Harold himself looked unusually serious. Rachel interpreted that seriousness as importance. Confidence practically radiated from her posture as she crossed her legs elegantly beside Daniel in the conference room. A thick folder sat centered on the polished oak table between us. My name appeared across the front in black lettering. Evelyn Parker Estate Review. Rachel folded her hands neatly. We really appreciate you helping us organize everything, she said smoothly. Harold adjusted his glasses slowly before sitting down across from us. Of course, he replied evenly. That is exactly why we are here. Daniel looked exhausted again. His shoulders slumped beneath his navy overcoat, while dark circles shadowed his eyes. For one brief second, I almost felt sorry for him. Then I remembered him sitting silently at the dinner table while his wife discussed my future like unwanted furniture. Harold opened the folder carefully and began reviewing documents in his calm attorney voice. Trust, structure, property ownership, asset protections. Rachel nodded along attentively as though she already belonged in these conversations. Then Harold reached a final section and paused. The room became strangely still. Even the sound of traffic outside seemed distant suddenly. There is one clause Mr. Parker requested remain confidential unless certain conditions arose, Harold said quietly. Rachel's smile flickered slightly, but quickly returned. What kind of conditions? She asked lightly. Harold removed a separate document from the folder. Attempts involving coercion, manipulation, intimidation, or improper pressure placed upon Mrs. Parker regarding removal from the marital residence. Silence. Complete silence. Daniel looked up sharply for the first time all morning. Rachel blinked once, slowly. Harold continued reading in the same calm tone. Any beneficiary found participating in such conduct immediately forfeits all inheritance rights connected to the Parker family trust, including property access, liquid assets, and future distributions. Daniel's face drained of color so quickly it frightened me for a moment. What? He whispered. Rachel sat perfectly still beside him, but I noticed her fingers tightening around the edge of the conference table. Harold calmly opened another folder. Additionally, he continued, Mr. Parker requested documentation be reviewed if concerns ever arose. He pressed a small recorder onto the table and clicked play. Rachel's voice filled the room almost instantly. We cannot keep waiting forever. If she refuses to cooperate, this gets much harder legally. Another recording followed. We need the house cleared eventually. Then another. It would make everything much easier if there was no confusion later on. Rachel's expression collapsed piece by piece with every sentence. Daniel stared at her in open disbelief like a man finally seeing his own life clearly for the first time. But I said nothing. I simply folded my hands quietly in my lap while the truth settled across the room heavier than stone. Harold lowered the recorder gently onto the table. Mrs. Parker remains sole controlling owner of the residence and trust, he said, calmly. And based on these conversations, the forfeiture clause has officially been activated. Rachel turned toward me then, her face pale beneath perfect makeup. For months, she had looked at me like an aging obstacle standing in the way of her future. But sitting across that conference table, for the first time since Thomas died, she finally understood something very simple. I was never the weak one in this family. The drive home felt longer than usual, even though traffic was light along the Merritt Parkway. Rain drifted softly against the windshield while the heater hummed low inside the car. Nobody spoke for nearly 20 minutes. Rachel sat rigid in the passenger seat staring straight ahead, with both hands clenched tightly in her lap. Daniel gripped the steering wheel, so hard his knuckles looked pale beneath the dashboard lights. I sat quietly in the back seat watching familiar Connecticut neighborhoods pass by one after another. Small coffee shops, white church steeples, children climbing onto school buses beneath bare November trees. Ordinary life continuing while our family collapsed in silence. When we finally pulled into the driveway, Rachel stepped out of the car immediately and disappeared inside the house without a word. Daniel remained behind with the engine still running. For a moment, he looked exactly like the little boy who used to panic before confessing broken windows or failed report cards. Lost, ashamed, afraid. He turned slowly toward me, eyes red around the edges. Mom, he said quietly, I did not know about those recordings. I studied his face carefully before answering. Age had softened him physically over the years, but weakness had hollowed something deeper long before today. You knew enough? I replied calmly. The truth landed harder than shouting ever could have. Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. I thought we were helping you, he whispered weakly. Helping me? I almost smiled at how desperately people cling to comforting lies even after truth sits directly in front of them. No, I said softly. Rachel was helping herself. You just decided it was easier to stay quiet than disappoint her. He flinched slightly at that. Rain tapped steadily across the roof of the car, while neither of us moved. Finally, Daniel rubbed both hands across his face and asked the question I think he already knew the answer to. What happens now? I opened the car door slowly and stepped out into the cold afternoon air. That depends entirely on what kind of man you decide to become, I said before walking toward the front porch alone. Inside the house, the silence felt different now. Not tense, not uncertain, empty in a strangely peaceful way. Rachel stood in the kitchen beside the marble island with her arms folded tightly across her chest. The pearl earrings were gone. Her makeup had faded slightly around her eyes, leaving behind the first visible crack in the perfect image she spent years constructing. You recorded us, she said coldly the moment I entered. I removed my gloves carefully and placed them beside the fruit bowl on the counter. No, I answered calmly. I protected myself. Rachel laughed once under her breath, but there was no confidence left in the sound. You knew exactly what you were doing. Eventually, I admitted quietly. Her expression hardened. After everything Daniel and I sacrificed to help you after Thomas died? That sentence told me everything I needed to know. Not grief, not family, transaction, investment. She had always viewed kindness as currency that deserved repayment. I looked around the kitchen slowly. The white orchids she bought sat near the sink. Renovation magazines remained stacked beside the coffee machine. Paint samples still covered part of the island. For months, she had slowly redesigned my home inside her imagination while waiting for me to disappear politely. You should start packing your things, I said softly. Rachel stared at me as though she genuinely believed she misheard the sentence. Upstairs, I heard Daniel moving heavily through the hallway floorboards. Excuse me, she asked carefully. This house belongs to me, I replied, and I would finally like to grieve my husband in peace. For several seconds, Rachel simply stood there frozen beside the kitchen island. Then she grabbed her handbag sharply and walked out of the room without another word. A few moments later, the front door slammed hard enough to rattle the hallway frames. I remained standing alone in the kitchen long after the sound disappeared. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun falling softly across the backyard. Tiny white flakes drifted around the porch swing Thomas built 20 years earlier. I walked slowly toward the window and rested one hand against the cool glass. For the first time since my husband died, the house no longer felt like it was being taken away from me piece by piece. It felt like mine again.